Really happy to have Michael here. He's the founder of Box of Crayons, author of The Coaching Habit, which is a fantastic book, and has recently put out The Advice Trap, which I quite honestly didn't get a chance to do and look at yet, but I will.
What?
I
That's
know.
it, I'm done.
Michael's out. But he has a new TEDx talk out there called How to Tame Your Advice Monster. All around a good guy, and everyone doesn't love biographies because they're kind of like boring to read. But more importantly, what's the one thing keeping you busy as you're stuck at home right now?
Well, I tell you, the thing for me is that I'm in this moment of transition. So I founded this company called Box of Crayons, and 9 months ago, I stopped being the CEO, and 4 months ago, really stopped being an active, everyday member of that company. And then I had these two big projects I was working towards: launching the new book, which, if anybody's written a book before, you know how miserable that whole experience is. I mean, writing books, massively overrated as a good experience. And also the TED Talk, which came out on the same day the book launched, on February the 29th. And I do a lot of presentations. I'm pretty comfortable in front of a crowd, but they're like, this is the most important presentation of your life. Do not screw this up. If you screw it up, you will shame yourself. You will shame TEDx. You will shame everybody. I'm like, oh, so I practiced and I practiced and I practiced. But come March the 1st, after those two big things had happened, I was like, okay, I don't have any really big projects. So what I'm actually trying to do, Rob, is to not overfill my calendar, because at a time like this, when, you know, everybody's anxious and uncertain, just in general, it's very easy to go, let me fill the space with busyness as a way of trying to avoid some of the harder things that are going on. And I'm really trying to stay less busy, less crowded, less overscheduled, as I have been since about the age of 9, to kind of go, what's next for me? What's emerging? What am I seeing in the markets? How's this world changing right now? So that's what's keeping me busy, is attempting not to be overly busy.
Right. Well, in that attempt, we do appreciate you offering an hour of your time and your expertise and insights, and really looking forward to the next, 55 minutes. So that being said, I'm going to hand over the reins to yourself. It looks like
Perfect.
Over 210 people are already here. So
amazing. Thanks everybody for joining us. There'll be a brief moment while I try and figure out how to move between my slide deck and their slide deck. This shouldn't be too hard. There we go. And there we go. Rob, tell me you're now seeing my slides.
I am. All good.
I love it when a plan comes together. So we'll do a really quick introduction, because and we've already covered most of it, but there I am. There's me actually doing my TED Talk. And I'll just tell you a funny story. In the TED Talk, it gets posted on the video, so you can go Google it now and see it on YouTube. And the title is How to Tame Your Advice Monster. And my two favorite comments in the comment box. The first is this. Some woman said, I tried to watch this, but I couldn't because his pants were too tight. I'm like, okay, that's awesome. And then the second piece was somebody going, here's some advice. Comb your hair before you go on stage. I'm like, that is my hair comb. That is me actually having put my hair into something. So anyway.
My eyes didn't go to your pants or your hair. It went to your awesome shirt. So I don't know what these people are saying.
There were a few people who said I had an awesome shirt, which I like. But as with everything, it's always the bad comments that stand out. You guys at WorkTango would know that better than most in terms of how to read and weight comments in terms of surveys and the like. Those are the two books. The Coaching Habit, as you said, it has become the best-selling coaching book of the century, with about 800,000 copies sold now, which is pretty amazing. And then the Advice Trap, that's a month or so out there in the world, which is exciting. And you see they sit together perfectly, like brother and sister or cousin or something, in terms of the design. Box of Crayons, we help organizations transform advice-driven to curiosity-led. But that's it. That's enough of the self-promotion. Let's get on this way to an awesome webinar. And
on my screen, it's actually pointing right at your face. So that's actually perfect. I don't know if everyone else is seeing that.
That's hilarious. Wasn't designed like that, but there we go. I'll keep with it. I start every webinar with this question. And so people, this is your chance to check out the chat box, because you heard Rob and Stephen say we need this to be interactive. I've got a question for you. I need you to give yourself a score between 1 and 7. And the question is this: how focused do you plan to be over the next 50 minutes or so? Because we all know there are 1,000 temptations during a webinar. First of all, you're already exhausted from the amount of time you're spending on Zoom. You're like, I've never spent this much time looking at a camera before. So already your brain is tired. But you've got your phone out, your other phone out, the kids are playing, there's something burning in the kitchen. There's 1,000 ways you could get distracted. So I want you to choose how focused you show up to be. One is a commitment to be completely unfocused. You know, you're actually letting the kids set something on fire. You're actually texting somebody at the moment. You've actually set something alight in your own home office just so you can smell the smoke. You're like, Michael's a charming man with an awesome accent. I'll just have him blathering on in the background while I do a bunch of other stuff. That's a 1. A 7, on the other hand, is you're bringing this sense of full focus to this webinar. You shut the door, you put that sign on the door that says, Mum is in a meeting. The answer is no, not now, or in the kitchen, or wait till dinner. You've moved the monkeys out, you've cleared your desk, you put your phone away, you've shut down the windows. And honestly, I don't mind what number you're giving yourself, and I'd like to see it in the chat box there. But my request for you is this: do one thing to adjust your environment to hit the number that you would like to hit. You know, I want you to make it easier for you to show up in the way that you want to show up. So what's one thing you need to do to make your environment a little more the way you want it to be so you can hit that number? And Rob, before we go on, I'm going to ask you, first of all, what number did you give yourself?
I put a 10.5, so I don't know if that's legal, but I'm in.
Well, I love that. I mean, I don't ever want you to do my accounts, because if we're on a 1 to 7 scale, 10.5 is excessive. But I love your commitment around it. And what are you seeing in the chat box? What sort of numbers are showing up there?
Yeah, so it actually started out with a bunch of 6s and 5s and 7s, and then there's a lot of 10s. And I think I'm seeing a trend here. People that have seen you speak before, I think, are a lot on the 9s and 10s because they know what's coming. I think there's some people saying, 6s, 7s, 8s. A lot of people are saying, does eating your lunch count as distractions and things like that? But I think we have a good group here, and I think you're right. There's so many distractions, especially working from home, that might be another reason why they're not all 10s. But yeah, that's what we're seeing.
You know, my request is simply that you're mindful about how you're showing up. You know, you're here, you actually made the time to give yourself this hour to work with Rob and me, which is fantastic. I just want you to make the most of it. And I just want you to give you the best chance that you will. And that's around removing the distractions that you want. So whatever it is for you, I don't mind. Your choice, you're an adult, but adjust your environment and let's get on with it. Let me tell you why I wrote The Advice Trap. Because, as I said, it is a miserable experience writing a book. I mean, you start off with an idea, you write a first draft, which is terrible. I mean, it's such a bad thing, your first draft of a book. So you write a second draft and it only gets worse. And then by the time you're on the 4th draft, quite frankly, it's got back to about the same level it was in the first draft, even though your ideas are getting clearer. By the 7th draft, your book's actually looking okay, but now you hate the idea, you hate the book, you hate yourself. You've got to be slightly mad or have a really good reason to write a book. So why did I write The Advice Trap? Because honestly, the coaching habit is doing great by itself. Well, with the coaching habit, there is a fundamental request of a behavior change, and it's this: can you stay curious a little bit longer? Can you rush to action and advice giving a little bit more slowly? Because here's what I know to be true. Most of us are advice giving maniacs. We have what I called an advice monster. And it kind of, anytime somebody starts talking, your advice monster kind of looms up out of the dark and goes, oh, I'm going to add some value to this conversation. Just watch me go. And we know this advice monster because not only do you know it in yourself, you know that you love to default to giving advice, to jumping in with ideas, opinions, solutions, but you've been on the receiving end of it 1,000 times as well. You know, you start telling somebody, and after about 10 seconds, they have the audacity to start telling you what to do, and you know how annoying that is. This goes beyond just mansplaining. This is just an annoying human trait. And when I wrote the coaching habit, and in the coaching habit, it says here are 7 essential questions. And if you ask these questions, you'll shift the way that you show up as a manager, as a leader, as a human being, because this works with kids and spouses and parents as well as it does with the people in your organization. You know, there's a bunch of people who went, this is great. I can use these questions and actually things are shifting and it's working for me. But there's a bunch of people who went, you know what, this, even though I know the questions in theory, in practice, I find them really hard to do. So the starting point is to go, all right, so what's wrong with advice anyway? I mean, really, are you saying, Michael, you should never give advice? So let me be absolutely clear. I am not saying that. Advice is critical. It's a key part of how we operate as human beings. It's how civilization has moved forward. I mean, you go to the British Museum and you see cuneiform tablets from Egypt and you're like, that's advice. They're people passing on information. So it has its role. But there are 3 ways that advice doesn't work as well as you wish it was. And by advice, I mean your advice. And I'm going to ask you at the end of this, I'm going to get you to put your answers in the chat box, which of these 3 reasons resonated most powerfully for you. Here's the first of the 3 reasons. The first reason is this: you're not working on the right problem. Here's what I know to be true. In your organization, there's a lot of very smart people, you included, working very hard to try and solve the wrong problems, because you get seduced into thinking that the first challenge that shows up is the real challenge, and it almost never is. But because your advice monster wants to leap in and start fixing things, as soon as somebody mentions something that could possibly be half a problem, you're like, let's try and solve that right away. So there's your first issue with your advice. You're busy trying to solve the wrong problem, not just because you haven't understood it, but quite frankly, the person who's come to talk to you actually doesn't really know what their real challenge is either. Neither of you really know what's going on, and neither of you are taking the time to figure it out. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that somehow you and that other person have arrived with great clarity and great insight, and you figured out what the real challenge actually is. And you're like, I've got it. This is the thing that if we could crack this, if we could solve this, would make all the difference. Well, then we get to the second issue with advice, which is this: your advice is not nearly as good as you think it is. And if you're thinking to yourself, Michael, it is true, now you mention it, other people's advice is terrible. I mean, quite frankly, it's awful. But my advice is pretty awesome. I don't know what you mean when you say my advice isn't that good. Well, I'd encourage you to do some reading, go watch a TED video or 3 on cognitive biases, because we have this wiring in our head that keeps telling us, look, your advice is awesome because you're awesome. No, you're amazing. And once you get into understanding cognitive biases, you'll understand not only is your advice not that great most of the time, but the more confident you are that you give great advice, the more likely it is that you give terrible advice. So you're strutting yourself at the moment going, no, I give great advice. You're like, oh no, you're probably worse than most of them. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that not only do you have the right challenge, but you actually have a brilliant idea. It is brilliant. It would solve the problem. It's fantastic. It's on point. It's gold dust. Well, here's the third issue with the advice that you give. And this is a real crossroads moment, a kind of leadership moment, which is it possibly sharing that advice is not displaying the leadership that is required, because you're at a crossroads. You're at this moment where you go, I could be the person who provides the fast answer. So that, like, they come to me, they're like, here's the problem. You're like, good, here's the answer, get out of here. Or you could be the person who says, look, my job is less about providing the answer. My job is to help them figure out what the real challenge is and to help them figure out what the best answer is. Because each one of those has prizes and punishments. Each one of those has benefits and disadvantages. The significant disadvantage of the default response of, I'll just tell you the answer, is that you are training them that you are the person with the answer, that anytime they run into a difficulty or even not a difficulty, they're like, just come to you and you will be the person who tells them what to do. And there's a fundamental message that you are communicating and that they are hearing when you do that. And that fundamental message is this: I am better than you. You're not good enough to figure this out. If you are on the receiving end of somebody else's advice monster time and time and time again, it is a deeply disempowering act. And one of the most powerful things that you can do as a human being, this is not just a formal hierarchy thing, this is with other people in your life, whether they're in your organization or outside your organization, is to say, look, my job is not to have the answer. My job is to help other people figure out the answer, figure it out for themselves, because that is the act of empowerment. So look, those are the three challenges around giving advice. One is you don't have the right problem. The second is your advice isn't as good as you think it is. And the third is that even if you've got the right insight and the right answer, it may not be the right leadership act. I'm curious to know which one of those three resonated most for you. I'd like you to put your answer in the chat box. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to check in with Rob. Rob, which of those really resonated for you?
I think number three, and as while we're waiting for these to come in, I had one question, and maybe you're going to get to this, but yeah, for the first one, in terms of the not being the right problem, how do you help, like as a leader, get someone to understand that that's not the right problem, or what are the right conversations? And again, you might get there, but that's one thing that comes to mind in terms of maybe how I approach, employees in an organization.
Well, I've got some thoughts on that, but I mean, for you, Rob, I mean, you're an experienced leader. WorkTango is a significant organization. How do you do that at the moment?
I mean, for me, it's one, it goes into priorities, right? Like sometimes it's not just a problem, it's just not the problem at that time. So that's how I try to address and say, listen, like, although that's what we're working on, we have a goal setting or whatever the process is, we need to be focused on this, or the world's changing around us, and we might have to shift that. But it's also really just asking them, what they feel is the right priorities. That's how I usually attack it. That's why I'm asking. Like, I don't have a really good answer on how I approach it.
And did you notice how I answered the question?
Well, I heard it, but I couldn't verbatim it back to you.
Yeah, I didn't. I did a classic lazy coaching piece, and this is the script, and this might be useful for people to write down and take away because I use this all the time. And Rob demonstrated it perfectly, which he didn't even really notice what I did. I went, good question, Rob. I've got some answers. I'll share them with you. But before I give you my answers, what are your first thoughts on this? And Rob's like, well, I'm glad you asked, because I do have some first thoughts on this. And he's away and he's into it. And he doesn't even know that we're having a coaching conversation. He just feels like we're having a conversation. It just feels like I'm helping him think some stuff through. At Box of Crayons, we have these three coaching principles: be lazy, be curious, be often. Really powerful, slightly provocative. Being curious, people are already starting to get, right? It's like tame your advice monster, because you're an advice-giving maniac. Being often is actually, in some ways, the most radical of those three, because it says, look, every interaction with somebody can be a bit more coach-like, because it's about being a bit more curious. So whether you're in person or by Zoom or by text or by email, every interaction with somebody can be led through curiosity. But being lazy is the hard thing, because if you're one of the 250 people who have shown up here, you are not an inherently lazy person. You're committed to growth. You're committed to self-growth. You're committed to success in your career. You're like, I don't want to be lazy. And you're like, actually, you want to be lazy. You want to stop rushing in to try and help solve other people's problems for them. But Rob, what you're talking about is part of the challenge, which is, the way I put it is this: the people around you have trained you nicely to do the work for them. I don't know. Just go and ask Rob. He'll do all the hard work and figure this out and think about it. And then you can just get the answer, and it saves conflict. You don't have to think it through. Rob feels happy about it. I feel happy about it. You collude into a slightly dysfunctional working relationship together.
I love.
Let's check in on the chat that's coming through. I know there's a lot of answers being typed in there.
Yeah.
What are you seeing? Which ones seem to resonate for people out of those 3 issues around advice?
Yeah, but before telling you that, I like this comment that said, "I like that. Be lazy." I'm going to start implementing that now. So hopefully, Helen, you're still with us and you didn't leave the webinar.
Well, when I first shared laziness, often people are like, "I don't know what you're talking about, but that's not going to work for me." And by the time we're done, we're like, "Oh, I get lazy. Oh no, I'm doing lazy now." Which is like, I want you to work less hard, but have more impact in the work that you do, and that's what being more coach-like can really bring.
Yeah, but to your question, there's a significant number more of 3s than anything else. Probably second is probably 2s, and then rounding out the last one are probably the 1s. And before you get into that, is that normal? Is it common? Like, I'm interested to know, based on those problems that are out there, what you might see.
Well, it's a reflection of the caliber of the people on the call, because the first 2 are a inefficient working process. The third one is a fundamental leadership issue. How do I choose to show up as a leader? How do I choose to empower the people around me? Do I recognize my own patterns that aren't working as a leader? And I think that's what we're speaking to here, which is, and this is a really key insight, which is, so often we think about, how do I help my people be more coach-like or be coaches? And we're like, I'll train them. I'll give them the 7 questions, and or whatever it is, whatever model you happen to be training your people in. And it doesn't work often enough, because actually it turns out the 7 questions are just the tactics. They're just the tools. Actually, the more fundamental piece is actually, how do I tame an advice monster? How do I change the way I think about leadership? It's not a casual thing. When I go, shift the way you think of yourself from somebody who provides the answer to somebody who helps figure out the problem, that is a significant shift in how you reframe your role. And that's the kind of deeper change that's required to help people step into this place of becoming a much more effective leader. Let's jump on, Rob.
Yeah. There was actually, there's a good question here that, and again, you might get to this, but it basically asks, can you speak into sharing experiences versus advice? And the impact of that and why? Because I think that might be a natural reaction to say, well, when I used to do this, or what we used to do in the past, and you might get there, but I thought it was a good time to ask it.
Sure. Here's what I would say in general. Whenever I'm speaking, I'm often asking myself, in whose service is this? Is this about me, or is it about them? Is this actually useful for them, or is it actually more useful for me? And I think that a lot of the time that you're speaking, it's more about you than it is about them. And I think there's a way that you can dress up sharing experiences as going, look at me, I'm being empathetic, I'm understanding them, and I've walked that same path. And that might be the case, and that may be how it works. But I feel that often enough, you don't need it. And actually often sharing experiences is just code word for, I hope you're picking up the advice that is embedded in the story I'm telling you. So if you want to be empathetic, the most powerful way is to actually be fully present and truly listen to what's being said. Rather than going, I'm kind of listening, I'm kind of fake listening because I'm actually trying to think in my head what I need to tell you, or I'm just waiting for you to shut up so I can tell you the advice I want to tell you. It's like, be really present with them. Be connected to that person as a human being. Say, yeah, wow, I get that. That must be hard. Sure, yeah, I see why that's difficult. That's empathy. You don't need to go, it reminds me of the time that I was in the Greek Isles and I was on a boat and we went fishing and I ate this and I saw that. They're like, now it's about you. Now it's your story. It's not my story anymore. So that's a generic answer, which is like, really, why are you talking? Is this really helpful? Why are you asking that question? Is that going to be helpful for them to get smarter, or is that you trying to find out more information so that you can give more advice? That's the fundamental place that I go in answer to that. Does that land for you, Rob?
Yeah, it's good. And I was gonna let you move on, but but one thing that someone just asked the question, the moment you said empathy, and the question was, does emotional intelligence impact this? And maybe that's part of what your conversation was about. Not sure if any other nuggets on that concept of emotional
Yeah.
intelligence.
So emotional intelligence, I'm not sure anybody, most people, there's a lot of definitions for emotional intelligence. So it's one of those slightly vague terms that can float around a bit. Emotional intelligence for me, if you're emotionally intelligent, you kind of have a perspective of the impact you are making, and you're able to make choices as whether you want to tinker with that or not. It's kind of like you got that external perspective on who you are and how you're showing up. I think being more coach-like is one of the great acts of emotional intelligence, because it's you taming your advice monster. So on the one hand, one of the principles of being more coach-like is be lazy. On the other hand, you are working really hard around a whole bunch of self-management stuff. Because when you show up with curiosity rather than answers, Rob, even when you've heard why advice isn't that great. Wrong problem, wrong advice, wrong leadership moment. Even if all of those three things are true, it is the wrong problem, it's terrible advice, and it's not a good act of leadership. You're still like, it feels pretty good. I feel pretty good telling people what to do right now, because quite frankly, it strokes my ego. I feel in control. We're going to get into this in the advice monsters in just a second. When you ask a question, it is a moment of empowerment. You are empowering that other person. Here's what comes with that. You are giving them power. You are giving them control. You are giving them status. You are giving them authority, which means you are diminishing your own power and control and status and authority. So when you ask a question, it's like not as pleasant. You're like, I don't know, was that a good question? Did it land? What are they going to say? Where's this conversation going now? How do I look smart? How am I adding value? And it is difficult. This is the self-management. In some ways, if you can go all the way back to Robert Greenleaf in the 1970s and his seminal book, Servant Leadership. This is servant leadership, which is like, I am willing to lead in a way that is less comfortable for me for the sake of the people with whom I'm interacting, so they can become more competent and more confident and more self-sufficient and more autonomous, because I know that not only will that be a benefit to them in the short and the medium term, but it's going to be a benefit to me as well. Because if I'm leading a team that is full of people who are competent and confident and autonomous and self-sufficient and creative, then we're going to get better stuff done, and I'm going to work less hard, and I'm going to have more impact. Let's keep going, because we're touching on some of the stuff I wanted to get to. Why is this so hard? Well, for some of us, this isn't so hard. I kind of referred to this a bit before. I'm like, it's like trying to teach people to swim. And there are some people, when I gave them the coaching habit and I gave them the 7 questions, they're like, oh, I'm away. They're off the blocks. They're fantastic. I'm diving in. I'm like, it's great. I'm starting with what's on your mind. I'm asking what's the real challenge here for you. I'm finishing with what was most useful or most valuable. The 7 questions have just become this inherent part of how they work together. I love that. But there's just a lot of people who sit there on the diving blocks going, I can't quite get in the pool. I keep wanting to dive into the coaching pool, but I just keep behaving in my old way of behaving. It's frustrating. And I dug into this. I'm like, okay, we've got to get to the heart of behavior change. In the coaching habit, I get the first chapter is about, and people can download the first chapters for free at thecoachinghabit.com. But the first chapter is about, let's talk about about habit building. What are the building blocks of habit? What's the new habit formula, which I'm going to share in just a little bit. And I'm like, once you know how to build a habit, you can actually do great things. Turns out that that's not entirely true. Habit building is essential. You want to understand how to build good habits, but it's not sufficient sometimes. We get into the difference between easy change and hard change. And this is, people write big books about this. So in 10 minutes, I can only touch on it, but I want to give you a basic sense of what this is about. People talk about change and change management all the time. And they go, change is hard. Yeah, change is difficult. Yeah, change is good. You should do that first. And I'm like, you know what? Some change is hard and some change is less hard. There is something called easy change. And easy change, we do this all the time. We're doing it right now. You know, there's a bunch of us who are like, oh, suddenly I have to work from home. And for most of us, we're like, okay, so I'm going to set up my computer here, and I'm going to get a microphone, and I'm going to get a better camera, and I'm going to build a door. And you know, it took a little bit, but I started off not being that good at it. I started off thinking that I could do Zoom calls without wearing clothes. And then you pretty quickly figure out you need to wear clothes, and you get the hang of it, and you improve, and you're like, okay, I'm okay at working at home now. That's easy change. And I like to think of that as kind of like downloading an app. It's like adding to what's already there. It's like, this is just additional content to what's already there. But there are plenty of challenges we face, which I would call hard change. And you know this. They're the challenges that you hear about once a year from your performance review, where, you know, Rob sits you down and goes, hey, Michael, last year we talked about you needing to do this better. And you still kind of suck at it. And I go, damn it, I've been working on that all year. I really want to crack whatever it is, you know, being a better communicator, being more strategic, being more coach-like, whatever it might be. But for some reason, I just can't get it sorted. And I think this is true for how people show up to be more coach-like. I think for some of us, it's easy change. It's downloading the 7 questions or whatever. Some of us, it's hard change, because hard change is not an app. It's actually requiring a new operating system. And you can get a new operating system, but it requires rewiring yourself. It requires you leveling up. It requires you understanding that this is a commitment to future you, not a refinement of present you. I want to talk about the 3 advice monsters, because that's what we're going to get into now, because hard change is all about learning how to tame your advice monster. And that's what I want to dig us into. But I'm just curious to ask the people and comments in the chat box, comments and questions. You know, what's been useful about that so far, that little piece around easy change and hard change, and some of the other answers you've heard me share with Rob? What was useful or valuable for you in all of that? And Rob, I'm curious to know what struck a chord with you.
Yeah, so actually, while those were popping in, I had a similar thought to a question that came in that said, with a little more context, said, I've taught this concept to people, and one of the leaders said it took almost 2 years before he and his team made a full transition to interacting this way. So the question was, like, in your experience, how long is that transition? Like, you can download an app in a minute. Changing your operating system might take a little longer. And any advice or thoughts around kind of the time frame?
No. Because it just depends. I mean, I've seen really rapid transformation because it depends on a whole bunch of things. It depends on the bigger context. You know, this is our organization and how we behave around here. It can but depend on the smaller context. Here's our team, and here are the people on this team. It can depend on how many people find this easy change versus hard change. It can depend on how much influence you have on the externalities that can make a difference. You know, I love Chip and Dan Heath's book, Switch. It's one of the great kind of easy access primers on change. And they talk about, they share a metaphor. It's not theirs, they got it from somebody else, around, you can think of change as a person riding an elephant, walking along a path. You got the person on the elephant, you got the elephant, you got the path. And those can break down into the 3 components of change. You've got the person on the elephant, that's the rational case for change. You've got the elephant, that's the emotional case for change, the kind of what's in it for me. And then you've got the path, that's the kind of environment around us that influences the way that we behave. And our focus always goes on the rational case for change. You know, if you're in an organization, you're going, we need to bring coaching into our organization. You're like, and here are the statistics why. Here's the HBR article on why. And you know what? The rational case for change persuades nobody. It's very annoying. But if all the other things work, then the rational case for change is the kind of cream on top that kind of makes it easier to swallow. But it never persuades anybody of and by itself. It's one of the great flaws of change management in general. Turns out the thing that is most significant in influencing how people behave is actually how you arrange the environment. So when you change the way that you meet, when you change the org chart, when you change the physical way that you connect with people, all of those have a more significant way of changing. I mean, again, working from home, and we changed the physical environment. You're now working in this different way. Your culture of your team has shifted. Your culture of your organization has shifted. You've been making rational cases for we should operate in this more destructured way for years. And you change the physical environment and boom, it actually happened. So in terms of that bigger question, how long does it take? It's like, it depends. The thing to be aware of is what is sometimes called the marathon effect, particularly if you're a leader. The marathon effect is if you're the leader of an organization. The metaphor is if you're running a marathon, the really good runners finish a marathon in like 2.5 hours, and they're like, yeah, we're done. That was awesome. Whew. Well, that's good. I can now relax and we can move on to other things. And if you're the leader of an organization, you're that fast runner. You've crossed the finish line first because you've been thinking about it longer. You've been in control of it longer. What you got to remember is everybody else is still on the marathon course, and some of them are going to be there for another 3 hours. You've got to wait till everybody crosses the finish line. And that's another way that these transformations can go wrong, is the leaders crossing the finish line going, well, if we're done, everybody should be done. It's never the case. What else, Rob?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great comments. And just a reminder for folks, if there's any comments, definitely make it in the chat. If it's an actual physical question, put it into Q&A. It'll be easier to manage. There's a lot of people on the webinar, but there's two major comments that are coming out in terms of what really resonated. One is that concept of the app operating system comparison. There's a really good comment here around just how easy it is to kind of position it that way. And then the other big major one was just the concept of, so a lot of stuff here. The commitment to a future you, like the thoughts around these easy changes. And if you can hit those easy changes at kind of around different times, and it's not this, it's a dial, not a switch, so to speak. There's a lot of comments around. Those are two that really resonated to people on the call. Nice.
We're not going to, we're at least a quarter of the way through the webinar so far. So the timing's going great. So I will say that there's ways to deep dive on some of this content on theadvicetrap.com. Questionnaire to take about which advice monster you are, a video facilitated process to figure out how to think about taming your advice monster, which kind of connects to the future you state. So there's a bunch of information, additional information there if you want to go deeper on it. Let's get into the advice monsters. And we're going to do this pretty quickly because we've got, 20 minutes left, 15 minutes left. So we finish at 5:02. So this will be a bit rapid fire, but go with me. It'll be fun. So we have an advice monster. People are recognizing I have an advice monster. I'm a human being, therefore I have an advice monster. Turns out that there are 3 different personas. Tell it, save it, control it. And I want to go through each one of them. We're going to talk about them. I want you to be thinking to yourself, which of these feels most real, strongest, most prevalent for me? Because I'm going to ask you that at the end. So let's talk about tell it. So tell it has persuaded you that your job, really your only job, this is your measure of value to your organization, to your life, is to have all the answers. You need to have all the answers. You need to have all the answers all the time. If you don't have all the answers all the time to everything, you are failing. And if you're failing, those around you are failing as well. Now, some of you will really understand this one, this strong pull to go, I've got to have the answers. If I don't have the answers, what am I? Now, here's the thing. For every advice monster, there are prizes and punishments to acting in this way. Prizes and punishments. So what I'd love to see in the chat box is what are the short-term wins to letting your tell it advice monster go loose? What do you think you benefit from that? And Rob, let me ask you, while we're seeing the chat box coming through, what do you think are some of the short-term benefits or prizes that people might get from having the tell it advice monster on the loose? And I think you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, just quick fixes and short-term gains.
Yeah. What else?
A lot of good ones coming here. Praise, promotions, people relying on you, first impressions, that's a cool one.
Yeah.
Expedience. Yeah, a lot of really great ones. Ego
Perfect.
boosts.
Yeah, so there's a nice range from the very practical expediency and time and let's get this stuff done to the more subtle, more ego-driven, which is like status and feeling good about yourself and feeling in control and being the important person. So you can see the short-term prizes, but with each prize comes punishments. So what's the price you pay? What's the price other people pay? What's the price your organization pays for you with an overactive talent advice monster? And again, throw your thoughts in the chat box. I'm loving all the chats that are coming through. Rob, what comes to mind for you? What's the price that gets paid?
The first thing I thought of, I read too, is bottleneck.
Yeah, totally.
Independence, disempowerment,
Right.
too much stress, not developing others.
Exactly.
There's a lot of really good ones here.
Yeah, lots of that. And of course, the fact that that realization that your advice actually isn't as good as you think it is. So you're probably offering up slightly crappy advice to solve the wrong problem, regardless of the fact you've got all that disempowerment, that you're the bottleneck, that you're training people to be incompetent. Because you're saying to them, you can't figure this out, come to me. I'm the only one who can figure this out. I'm the only one who's good enough, smart enough to have all the answers. And even if you have a better answer, I don't really care because my answer is going to be better because it's my answer. So there you go. You got tell it. I love that. Let's talk about the second one, save it. Save it's not as noisy as tell it, but just as insidious. Save it's put its arm around you and it's convinced you that the way you add value is to be responsible for everybody. Your job is to rescue everybody. You can't let anybody struggle or stumble or fail or have a hard time or not know the answer. You got to make sure everybody feels good all the time and that there's no danger ever of a mistake, of stumbling, or of failing. Now, I know some of you resonate that. I think perhaps if you're a parent, you may feel that strongly as well. Let me ask you this, and we'll do the same again. So what are the prizes? And again, short-term often. In the book, we call them wins, not wins, of having a save it advice monster. And Rob, what comes to mind for you?
I'm not on mute anymore. In terms of save it, I think it's just, I think it depends on if you actually solve, like if you don't even have the answer and you can't even do it yourself, you're trying to save people, but there's no kind of end game in terms of success of what you're looking to get done.
And what are you seeing coming through in the chat box?
So everyone's favorite, feel valuable, valued in a quiet way, peace of mind, temporary solutions, immediate wins, immediate gratification. Yeah.
I mean, there's a real sense that when you're in save it mode, there's this look what a big-hearted person I am. Look how much I care for everybody. And beyond that, more subtly, there's a kind of slight burning martyr involved. Look at me, I'm the only person who cares about people here, and I'm opening my veins and bleeding into the ground here in an effort to make my people fly. Of course, there is punishment involved. There's a price you and others in your organization pay. So what's the punishment here? What's the cost of having an overactive save it? And Rob, we'll see stuff got rolling through the chat there, but what comes to mind for you?
I mean, people aren't learning on the job. A couple of years saying it's robbing others of development. I like that. Resentment, learned helplessness in others.
Totally.
No one learns from their mistakes. Burnout, obviously, from a leadership perspective.
Exactly. So I love all of these answers. I mean, if you read The Coaching Habit, you'll know that I referenced a model in there called the drama triangle. And there's some sort of connection between these and the drama triangle. 3 roles that play out in a dysfunctional role: victim, persecutor, rescuer. 90% of people self-identify as rescuers. I'm there to try and save people, rescue them. And here's the thing: rescuers create victims. Rescuers create persecutors. Rescuers die of exhaustion because they're trying to save people who can't be saved. And you're fundamentally saying, I'm not going to treat you as an adult. You're not able, you're not capable of being responsible and accountable and making your own choices. I'm going to smother you as part of that. So tell it, save it. And And then the third, perhaps the most subtle of the three, is control it. Control it has convinced you that the way you add value, the way you win, is you maintain control at all times. You keep your hand on the steering wheel. You don't give up control. You maintain it from the start through the middle to the finish. Don't invite anybody else in. Don't share power. Don't share responsibility. Don't share accountability. But make sure you hold on to it for all that you're worth. Because if you give up just a little bit of control, chaos comes. And when chaos comes, you fail, they fail, everybody fails. The only way you manage is by keeping everything under tight control. So again, you know how this works now. What are the prizes for this? What do you think? What are the advantages of having this advice monster on loose? And Rob, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, especially being in a lot of high growth companies and seeing this world, you'll get the right answer for maybe the first time. If people are saying fewer errors, low risk.
Yeah. So exactly right. So you lower risk, you feel in control, you feel good. There's all that ego thing about, look, why would I give up control? I'm the best person here. I'm the only person who understands what's going on. I don't have to worry about what the hell other people are doing because I'm doing it all. But of course, there are punishments. So what are the punishments involved? And again, I'd love to see your comments in the chat box, but what comes to mind for you, Rob?
It's not scalable, right? Like at the end of the day, people are, when it comes to time when people are going to have to do this, people won't know how.
Yeah. So nothing is scalable if your advice monster is on the loose. You become that jam, you become that bottleneck. You also disallow serendipity. You stop the future from arriving because you are controlling it all from your own sphere of this is what I know, this is what I believe to be true, this is what I believe to be right. And therefore you don't allow those other inputs that can actually shape and shift and influence different ways of thinking and different ways of showing up. So those are the three advice monsters: tell it, save it, and control it. Here's what I would ask you. Which of those three feels most real for you? Which of those three feels most real for you? I'd love to see your answers in the chat box. The truth is you have all three. So let's be clear about that. You don't just have one, you have all three. But I'm wondering which one feels most real for you there. And of course, you can do that questionnaire at theadvicetrap.com. Rob, which is the one for you?
Yeah, so for me, it's I think it used to be a little more on the control side, just because building startup companies, etc. Yep. But I think I land more on save it now. Like I take
nice.
Engagement of employees seriously. I want them to have the best experience, and I kind of revert to that world. And it's interesting on the chat. Like I'm seeing a lot of twos here, and I wonder if it's because it's save it because it's an HR type audience, and they have that natural kind of place where they go. But personally, for me, it seems like a lot of people on here. Yeah, save it is a big one.
I agree with that, and it might be because we have a strong HR crowd here. I also would say more subtly, save it is the easier choice because it's slightly less threatening, because you can always reframe save it as being a noble act. And I just encourage you to go, is that true, or is that just a kind of, well, it's the lesser of the three evils, so I'll pick that because it kind of makes me feel good. So I'm being a bit provocative here. I'm being a bit challenging for you.
I like it.
So we're close to being done. How do you tame your advice monster? Well, we talked a little bit about that before you asked that great question, but fundamentally it's, can you stay curious longer? And not by a month or by a week or by a day. I'm going in a conversation. If you can stay curious another 2 or 3 minutes by having some good questions, by slowing down that rush to action and advice giving, that's the act, that's the leadership act that starts making the difference in terms of taming your advice monster. How do you do it? Well, I'm going to say it's a generic answer for you, which is to build a one question habit. Because what won't work is you leaving this going, Rob's amazing, Michael's amazing, I need to buy his books, although that is true, you do need to buy the books. I'll just try and be more coach-like. I'll just try and be more curious. I can promise you that if that's your commitment to behavior change, nothing changes. Some sort of generalized statement. It's like, okay, let's start with one person. Let's start with one question. What's the person that you're like, oh, my advice monster is rampant with that person? And you can go, I think you can go either one or two different places. Either go with somebody where you're like, this relationship's a disaster. I've got nothing left to lose anymore. Why don't I try it out with them? Because, you know, the worst that can happen is it stays bad. Or you go with someone where you're like, I have a really trusted relationship with this person. They'll let me try and practice new ways of behaving. And you're like, okay, that person, I know my advice monster there. I can feel how it shows up. And it's like, pick a question and build it into a habit. Here's a new habit formula. When this happens, instead of I will. When this happens, you articulate the moment with that person. When I have my one-to-one meeting with Rob, when we do the team meeting with my boss, when I'm on the call with my client, instead of, and then you like insert your advice monster behavior, jumping in, fixing it, solving it, having the answer, trying to make them feel good, maintaining control. I will. And it's like, pick a question. You know, if you Google the coaching habit, you'll find the 7 questions. In fact, if you go to thecoachinghabit.com, you can download the first 3 chapters and it gives you the 7 questions in there somewhere. So you can just pick a question and go, this is the question I want to try. And that's your commitment to building a 1-question habit. Theadvicetrap.com. So there's the question. I've talked about this enough, so you don't need to worry about that. Here's what I want to ask you. And this is the last act before we open it up to more general questions. We have covered a lot in this hour together. Through Rob, you've fed me some really great questions. It's been fun working with you. I want to know what was most useful for you. You know, we talked a lot. We talked about the advice trap. We talked about easy change and hard change. We talked about the 3 advice monsters. Out of everything, what was most useful or most valuable for you? And Rob, while we're letting some answers roll in, what was most useful or most valuable for you?
It was just framing the different advice monsters in just a simple way, right? Easy to understand, comprehend, know what it means personally to my action. So it was cool to reflect, and we'll continue to reflect on when I'm going down that road.
Perfect. Well, look, this has been a great webinar. I'm seeing like over 400 comments, which is extraordinary. Lots of people sticking around to the very end, which is also wonderful. So thank you to all of you who showed up. Rob, maybe as a kind of final thing, any ahas you want to share, and then whatever you need to do to, I should get out of here and take you to our final slide, right?
Oh, that's fine.
Okay. I think basically the last slide is what questions you have, right? So
yeah. So I guess just to round up some of the most valuable items, you know, the advice monsters came up a lot. To be a better professor, I need to stop rescuing all my students. That concept, the prizes and punishments, kind of added reality to people. It seems like in terms of what it means, the outcome of this type of theory or these thoughts. So I guess in the last 5 minutes, I'd love to do is just a couple of really good questions. And I apologize to everyone. I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm sure it's all in the book somewhere. But one that really stood out for me was how can you tame other advice monsters in the group that tend to fill the vacuum you are creating by being lazy?
That is a good, subtle question. The answer is fundamentally, you can't, because you can't control other people's behavior. It's that understanding that in your sphere of control is your own behavior and your own responses. However, in your sphere of influence are other people's behaviors. You can influence it, although you don't get final control over it. So different ways of doing that. Well, I know you know some of this already, but one is you pull them aside and you go, we need to have a conversation. We need to have, this is feedback. I'm going to tell you the impact of you rabbiting on. And you having the courage to do that, whether that's somebody who reports to you or a peer or a boss, say, this is the feedback I want to give you. And you will, because I know this is a strong HR crowd, you'll have assorted tools and techniques to give people feedback. A more subtle way, and this is a facilitator way if you're running the meeting, is to have less large group conversations and more small group conversations. So if I'm running a group, and you can do this on Zoom or online, I just go, right, I'm going to break you into groups of 3 or groups of 2. And I want you to have this conversation and then we'll report out. And then it's much harder for the chatty chat person to dominate and fill the space. And it's much easier for the quieter person who's likely to go, well, this is awesome, somebody else is doing all the talking, I'll just opt out, to opt out. So there's a structural way that you can influence that interaction as well.
Okay, great. Another interesting question here was, how do you tell controllers the negative impact they can have on a culture? Like, is there any way to try, any advice you have on how to let people self-aware or be self-aware as well?
Well, I think the way I would reframe this is, which fights are worth having? I think of the people I've known in the organizations I've worked, and there are some people I would be having that conversation with, and there are some people I'm like, there's no point. So I would say part of what you want to be doing is going, right, where do I spend my time and effort and energy and attention trying to make things better? Where might I have a chance of success? Where do I have influence? Where am I willing to take the risk? Because it's a fair bet that, somebody once said, the future's here, it's just unevenly distributed. In your organization, it's unevenly distributed. There are some people who get it. There are some people who are up for it. There are some people who don't want to talk to you about this. So you have to figure out where to pick your fights.
Great. And I'm going to kind of theme 2 or 3 questions together, but it was really about, you're not the person that's doing the coaching and these concepts, but they're being done to you. And I'm not sure if that's, part of what you talk about in the book at all, or if that's something that you have any thoughts on, but, is there any way to kind of manage up in that environment or somehow make it clear about the impact?
This is when somebody's giving you the advice rather than so
your boss is the advice monster.
Yeah. So it's not easy, because your advice monster, your boss doesn't even realize this is happening. They're like, look how helpful I'm being. So obviously you buy books for every single person. I am kidding. There is a concept that I learned from a guy called Peter Block, who's a great writer and thinker in this space, called social contracting. And social contracting is fundamentally, let's have a conversation about how we work together, not what are we working on. So your boss is not going to be able to guess that you would like things to be different. They're not going to be able to go, well, Rob's acting strangely. He must have been on a webinar. I'm sure this is a coded message for me. So maybe I'll just try and figure out what he's trying to say by not saying it and shift my behavior. So if you want things to be different, you get to have a conversation with them and go, let me tell you what I want. And, at a heart, a lot of the work I do is going, let me try and help people build adult to adult relationships in the work that they do. And an adult to adult relationship, you could define that as being able to ask for what you want, knowing that the answer may be no. So you may not get what you want, but you probably definitely won't get what you want if you don't ask for it.
Wonderful. So I want to be respectful to your time and everyone else is here, just coming up right at the top of the hour. First off, I want a big thank you for everyone that joined and participated. It's awesome to have this be more of a conversation than a one-way presentation. So thank you to you all again. And obviously a big thank you to the WorkTango team. A lot of effort goes into putting these things. So everyone in the background there. Thanks, everyone. And obviously to you, Michael. I know you're trying to be less busy and it's a busy time, especially with the new book, but really, really appreciate having you back. Really enjoyed and took a lot of the conversation. I have so many quotes here that I need to, scribe in a nicer way. But thank you very, very much. And
my pleasure.
And really,
it was lovely to have so many people stick with it and so much great input as well. And Rob, thanks for being such a gracious host as well. I really appreciate that.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, take care, be safe, and have a good rest of the day today.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.